צהריים טובים, good afternoon, boa tarde. In Parashat Ki Tisa, Moshe is on top of Sinai, receiving God's Torah. When God finishes speaking, God gives to Moshe the 2 stone tablets of the testimony written with God's finger. ויתן אל משה כחלתו לדבר איתו בהר סיני, 2 לוחות העדת, לוחות אבן כתובים באצבע אלוהים. Everything is perfect on top of Sinai, inside God's cloud. Moshe remained there for 40 days and 40 nights. At the foot of the mountain, the people were growing restless. The people saw that Moshe is taking too long to come down. וירא העם כי בושש משה לרדת מן ההר. The Israelites gather against Aaron, and they make an idol, a molten calf, a golden calf, עגל המסכה, to lead them. The verse says, כי בושש משה לרדת. According to Rashi, boshesh is the language of lateness. He resorts to Midrashic tradition, because it's Rashi, to explain that the people actually miscalculate the exact time that Moshe was supposed to come down from the mountain, which led the people to believe that Moshe would not be coming anymore. Let's put aside Rashi's interpretation for just a moment. Let's imagine Moshe was actually late in coming down from Sinai. כי בושש משה לרדת. The root of the word boshesh in Hebrew comes from bosh, which means shame. BDB, the Brown Driver Briggs Dictionary, translates boshesh as delayed in shame. And this is what we have to think about right now. Why would Moshe be delayed in shame? In my reading, Moshe delays in coming down because he's overcome by the perfection of God's Torah. This perfection overwhelms and terrifies him. This perfection, while he is on God's fiery cloud, this is when he experiences the vastness of the Torah that flows from God like milk and honey, like water from a mighty stream. At the same time that God's teaching galvanizes Moshe, the intensity of that experience makes him concerned about the level of holiness that is required of him. Moreover, it takes him to question his own ability to transmit this Torah to the people. The 10 Commandments are gradually unfolding into 613 mitzvot. How can Moshe possibly be able to convey their beauty and their relevance back to the people? Moshe feels inadequate. His insecurity comes from the shame he feels of not being good enough to be God's messenger of Torah to the people of Israel. As long as Moshe tarries on the mountain, he will not have to deal with these feelings. By remaining in God's presence, Moshe is protected from the messiness of dealing with his and the people's humanity. After all, we tend to be more ashamed in the presence of people than in the presence of God. God usually shows more compassion to the people than people show compassion to each other. Moshe's delay in descending can be attributed to his unwillingness to confront his feelings of shame. Moshe is procrastinating. Procrastination is what we do when we don't want to deal with emotions like anxiety, insecurity, frustration, or self-doubt. We procrastinate not because we have issues managing our time, but due to problems we have regulating our own emotions. Actually, procrastination is derived from the Latin procrastinare, to put off until tomorrow, which is very fitting in Moshe's case. If we choose to believe that Moshe was actually late, that might have led the Israelites to believe that either something had happened to him or worse, that maybe Moshe didn't care about them. The Israelites' pain due to Moshe's absence is expressed in the verse. That man Moshe, who brought us from the land of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. It is the voice of God that ends Moshe's paralysis and calls him to action. Lered, go see what your people are doing. And Moshe hurries down, clutching the perfect tablets. Shnei luchot haydad, luchot even ketuvim be'etzba Elohim. This is the Torah that he is meant to give to the people. When Moshe sees the calf and the dancing, he smashes the tablets. He destroys God's work of flawless Torah, this Torah from heaven, whose perfection made him disconnect from the Israelites, who in turn lost their connection with God. Moshe's reunion with the people makes him relate back to their humanity. Moshe's emotions, his anger, his shame, and sense of inadequacy are brought back into perspective. Brené Brown says that the antidote for shame is empathy. Moshe's shame is replaced by a deep empathy for his people as he pleads with God to forgive them for their sin of idolatry. It is Moshe's reconnection with the children of Israel that makes God realize that God should manage expectations in relation to the people, to Moshe, and to Torah. Torat Hashem Temima. The perfect Torah might not be a perfect fit for the people. It had brought out feelings of inadequacy in Moshe, and it had alienated the Israelites. God concludes that Torah cannot be only God's work. The second set of tablets, therefore, is crafted by both godly and human hands, carved by Moshe, written by God. God's partnership with Moshe gives us a Torah that invites holiness, not shame, that allows us to be holy as human, not as divine beings. This is the Torah that we know. Vezot HaTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei Israel al pi Hashem beyad Moshe. Parashat Ki Tisa makes us reflect on whose Torah it is that was given to us at Sinai. The first tablets made by God are shattered, yet the second ones, the product of God and Moshe's work, remain intact. We would believe that the opposite would be true. The greater the holiness, the more eternal. However, the first tablets had to be destroyed for God to realize that the essence of Torah, its relevance and holiness, rely on the collaboration of God and human beings, which is also the nature of written and oral Torah, revelation that meets interpretation. The moment God empowers Moshe by making him carve the second tablets, divine meets human and holiness becomes an attainable goal. In the words of the Kotzker Rebbe, your holiness should be that of human beings who are made of flesh and blood, not of angels. God has more than enough angels. God also learns an important lesson about humans. God realized the dangers of bringing humans too close to God's presence. When on top of the mountain, while God is teaching Torah to Moshe, God is modeling the perfect Hevruta process for teaching Torah for generations to come. God, the ultimate Rabbi, Moshe Rabbeinu, the first Talmid Chacham. Moshe's proximity to God, however, exposes a dangerous vulnerability. God also does not want Moshe to leave. God is also procrastinating. The golden calf disaster makes God aware of what happens when the relationship between divine and human becomes unbalanced. Torah loses its relevance. The prophet is late. The connection is severed. God can come down to the people, but human cannot ascend to God without losing touch with their own humanity. This is the reason why God speaks face to face, panim el panim, with Moshe in the tent of meeting at the foot of the mountain. But God refuses to let Moshe see the divine face, when Moshe comes up the mountain again. God's words to Moshe are, Vayomer panai yilchu, v'chanichonti lach. I will go before you, and I will give you rest. It is God who have to come to us so that we can walk in God's way. My blessing for you is that may the presence of God always remain among us, and may we learn and teach a Torah that is divinely inspired, but also inclusive of our human nature. Kaddish de Rabbanan, on page 13. יתקדל ויקדש שמי רבה. בעלמא דברה חילותה ימליך מהותה. וחייכון ותברכון ותחיי בכל בית ישראל בגלה ובזמן קריב ומרו אמן. יהיה שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולעלמיה. יתפרע וישתבח ויפואר ותרומן ויתנשא. ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריחו. לילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה תוש בחתה ונחמתה דמירן ועלמה ומרו אמן. על ישראל ועל רבנן ועל תלמידיון ועל כל תלמידי תלמידיון ועל כל מן לעוסקים באורייתא דברך חדי ודי בכל אתר ואתר. יהי לכון ולכון שלמה רבה, הנה וחסדה ורחמים, וחיים אריכים ומזונה רווחה, ופולקונה מנקודם עבור מבשמיה ומרו אמן. יהיה שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים טובים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום ונאמר, הוא ברחמיו יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.